By the 14th month of the drought, Larkspur County had stopped talking about rain and started talking about depth. How deep is your well now? How many feet did you drop this year? It was the only conversation left. The Sierra snowpack that fed the valley's rivers had come in at 31% of normal 2 winters running, and the aquifer underneath the county, the same one that had watered these fields for 4 generations, was dropping faster than anyone alive had seen it drop. Marlon Ott's well went dry in March, 640 feet down, a well his father had drilled in 1968. He wasn't the first. By June, 11 wells along the Larkspur Canal Road had gone silent, and men who had never called a drilling company in their lives were on waiting lists 8 months long, prices climbing past $180,000 a well, with no guarantee the new one would hit water either. And then there was the Ashcroft place.
220 acres on the east bank of Larkspur Creek. Walnut trees still holding their leaves deep green in July. Alfalfa cut and baled on schedule. Cattle drinking from a trough that had never once run dry. Neighbors driving past on Route David slowed down without meaning to. Some just looked. A few pulled over, walked to the fence line, and stood there the way you stand in front of something you can't quite explain to yourself. Wendell Ashcroft was 68 years old, and if you asked him directly how his well was still pulling water while the whole county went dust dry around him, he'd tell you the truth in about 4 words. I put it there. Nobody believed that answer the first time they heard it. Most people needed the whole story before it made any sense at all. And the story didn't start with the drought. It started 8 months earlier, in the middle of the wettest winter Larkspur County had seen in 11 years, with Wendell Ashcroft doing something that made half his neighbors think he'd finally lost his mind. He opened his headgates and flooded 40 acres of his own land on purpose. If you've ever done the harder, quieter thing, while everyone around you called it foolish, stay with us. This is the story of what Wendell knew that nobody else in the county had bothered to learn, and what it cost him to prove it. The storm system that hit Larkspur County that January was the kind old-timers still measure other storms against. 9 atmospheric river events in 5 weeks, the creek running 4 feet over its banks, the county's flood control district releasing water from the reservoir just to keep the levees from failing. Water everywhere. More of it than the ground could use, most of it simply running downstream toward the delta and out to the ocean. Gone for good. Wendell watched that runoff for 3 days before he did anything about it. He'd farmed this land since he was 19, taken it over fully when his father's heart gave out in 1987, and buried his wife Doris on a rise behind the walnut orchard 3 winters back. In all that time, he'd learned one thing about water in this valley that most of his neighbors had never had reason to think about. The ground doesn't just hold water. In the right place, it swallows it. Larkspur Creek ran over a bed of old alluvial gravel, coarse, sandy soil laid down over thousands of years by a river that used to run wild before anyone built a levee. Wendell's father had told him once, half joking, that the East 40 drained faster after a storm than any other field on the property. Water gone within a day, when everywhere else stayed muddy for a week. As a young man, Wendell had thought that was just bad luck, a field that couldn't hold water for the crops. It took him 30 years and one conversation with a hydrogeologist to understand it was the opposite of bad luck. Dr. Priya Rao worked for the county water district, and Wendell had met her at a groundwater workshop 2 years earlier that he'd only attended because Doris made him promise to go. Rao's presentation was about something called managed aquifer recharge, deliberately flooding farmland during wet years so the water percolates straight down through the soil and refills the underground aquifer instead of running off to the river. In sandy, coarse soil like the East 40, she said, water could move downward at 2 to 4 inches an hour. In tight clay soil, the kind covering most of the county, it barely moved at all. Wendell raised his hand that day,
and asked her a question that had been sitting in him for 3 decades. What if the fastest draining field on your farm wasn't a problem? What if it was a door?
Rao didn't have a simple answer that afternoon, but she drove out to the Ashcroft place 2 weeks later with a soil auger and a look on her face Wendell would remember for a long time. The look of someone finding exactly what they'd hoped to find. The East 40 sat almost directly above a coarse gravel channel, part of an old buried riverbed that connected straight down to the county's primary aquifer, nearly 300 feet below. Most of this valley is capped with clay that keeps water from ever reaching the aquifer naturally, she told him, kneeling at the edge of the field. This 40 acres isn't capped. It's basically a funnel. He didn't act on it that year, or the year after. It takes a wet winter to test a theory like this one, and dry winters were what the county had been getting. But that January, watching 4 days of floodwater roar past his property line toward a river that already had more than it needed, Wendell Ashcroft opened the headgates on the East 40 and let the water in. Hollis Tate farmed the section directly south of Ashcroft land, and he was standing at the fence line within the hour, watching 6 inches of water spread slowly across land that should have been growing alfalfa in 4 months. "Wendell," he called out, not quite believing what he was looking at. "You know that's your best field under there." "I know it," Wendell said. "You're drowning your own dirt in the middle of the wettest winter we've had in a decade, when every other man in this county is trying to keep water off his fields." Wendell didn't argue the point. He just kept walking the berms he'd built along the field's edge, checking that the water was spreading evenly instead of channeling into one low corner the way Rao had shown him. Hollis drove off, shaking his head, and by the following week, the story had made its way around the co-op, then the feed store, then the diner on Route 28. Wendell Ashcroft was flooding good cropland on purpose. Nobody in 3 counties had heard of anybody doing such a thing, at least not by choice. The teasing wasn't cruel, not at first. It was the kind of joke men make about a neighbor doing something they don't understand, half curiosity and half discomfort at watching someone break an unspoken rule. But it didn't stop, and by February, when a second storm rolled through and Wendell flooded the field a second time, the jokes had names attached to them. The men at the co-op started calling it Ashcroft's Swamp. His grandson, Cole, 22 and helping run the cattle side of the operation, came in from town one evening and asked him straight out if he was worried what people were saying. "I heard what they're saying," Wendell told him. "I've heard it before. Your great-grandfather planted walnut trees on this land, back when everyone around here was growing nothing but wheat. Took people 12 years to stop laughing about that, too." What nobody driving past could see was what Wendell was actually tracking underneath the surface. Rao had helped him install a monitoring well at the edge of the flooded field, a narrow pipe reaching 40 feet down that let him measure the water table directly instead of guessing. Every few days, alone at dawn before Cole was even up, Wendell walked out to that pipe with a weighted measuring tape and wrote the number down in a notebook that had belonged to nobody but himself. 22 feet. Then 19. Then 15 after the second flooding event. The water wasn't just sitting on the surface. It was moving down, exactly the way Rao's soil samples said it would. And Wendell was the only man in the county who could prove it with numbers instead of hope. He flooded that field 4 separate times that winter, catching every major storm before the runoff could reach the river, spreading roughly 60 acre-feet of water across those 40 acres in total, water that would otherwise have flowed 80 miles downstream and out through the delta without ever touching another root or refilling another well. An acre-foot is enough water to cover a football field a foot deep, nearly 326,000 gallons. So by March, Wendell had quietly pushed close to 20 million gallons of water down into ground that his neighbors were still driving past and calling ruined. Spring came in dry, not unusual dry, alarming dry. The state's snow survey teams measured the Sierra snowpack at the end of March
and posted a number that made the front page of the county paper. 31% of average, the second lowest reading in the survey's history. Water managers upstream started talking about mandatory cutbacks before summer even arrived, and Wendell, walking his fields in April with the alfalfa greening up and the walnuts leafing out on schedule, understood something the rest of the county hadn't caught up to yet. The dry winter everyone feared had already happened. It just hadn't finished happening yet. The signs were there for anyone watching closely enough, the way frost patterns and grass growth had once told his father things a calendar never could. Creek flow measured at the county gauge was already running 40% below normal by early May. Reservoir storage upstream sat at levels the district hadn't seen since a drought 15 years earlier. Wendell didn't need a hydrogeologist to read those numbers. He needed to remember what his own monitoring well was telling him and what it meant for the months ahead. That spring brought its own test, one that had nothing to do with rain. In late April, the first cutting of alfalfa on the recharge field came up thin and uneven in patches, nowhere close to what the rest of his fields produced. Wendell's stomach dropped the first time he walked that ground, certain he'd damaged something in the soil by flooding it 4 times over the winter. He called Rao that same afternoon. "It's not the recharge," she told him after driving out and pulling soil samples from 3 different depths. "You compacted the surface a little walking equipment over wet ground before it fully drained in February. That's a management mistake, not a recharge problem. Give the surface a season to loosen back up, and don't run heavy equipment on it again until it's bone dry." It was a small, unglamorous fix, aerating the compacted patches and holding off on machinery until the ground had firmed properly. But it mattered. It was the difference between a man who understood what he was doing and a man who'd gotten lucky once and didn't know why. By June, with the county's other wells already sputtering and pump repair trucks becoming a familiar sight on every road in Larkspur, Wendell quietly deepened his understanding of exactly how much margin his recharge had bought him. Rao ran the numbers with him one afternoon in his kitchen, cross-referencing his monitoring well readings against the county's regional aquifer model. 60 acre-feet spread across 40 acres of highly permeable ground had raised the local water table beneath the Ashcroft property by an estimated 18 feet compared to the surrounding area, a bubble of higher groundwater sitting directly under his own well. "That's not going to save the whole county," Rao said, "but it's very likely going to save your well through this drought, and probably the next one, too." Wendell didn't tell anyone about that conversation. Some things you don't need to announce. You just keep watching the trough stay full while the summer gets hotter, and you wait to see if you were right. The drought that had been building since the dry winter arrived in full by August. And it arrived the way droughts in the Central Valley always seem to, gradually and then suddenly all at once. Creek flow that had already been low in the spring dropped further as upstream reservoirs cut releases to protect what little storage they had left. The county's shallow wells, the ones drilled decades ago before anyone imagined pumping this deep, began failing first, one after another, each failure a phone call that spread through the community faster than the water table was dropping. Marlin Arts well, the first to go dry back in March, was joined by 9 more before the end of July. Hollis Tate's well, drilled to 580 feet in the 1990s, went dry on the 2nd of August, and Hollis stood in his yard that morning, listening to a pump run on nothing but air, a sound every farmer in that county had learned to dread. His cattle needed water trucked in within the week. His walnut trees, planted the same decade as Wendell's, dropped their leaves early, trying to survive on less than half the water they needed. Wendell's well sat at 620 feet, deeper than Hollis's, but not dramatically so, drilled into the same regional aquifer nearly every farm along the creek pulled from. By every reasonable expectation, it should have been struggling right alongside everyone else's. It wasn't. His pump ran the same steady rhythm it had run every August for 40 years, drawing from a pocket of groundwater sitting 18 feet higher than the surrounding water table, a pocket he had put there himself, one flooded winter storm at a time. Word moved through the county the way it always does when something doesn't add up. By the third week of August, cars had started slowing down at the Ashcroft fence line again, except this time, nobody was laughing. Hollis Tate came by on a Thursday afternoon, his own cattle trailer parked out front from hauling water the day before, and stood at the edge of the East 40 looking at alfalfa that had no business being that green in a county running dry all around it. "I need you to explain something to me," he said, and it wasn't the voice of a man delivering a joke this time. "How is your well still pulling water?" Wendell walked him out past the fence line to the monitoring pipe, the same one he'd been reading alone at dawn since January, and pulled the weighted tape up to show him a number instead of an explanation. "Water table right here sits about 18 feet higher than yours does right now," he said. "I put it there in January and February, 4 floods, about 60 acre-feet total, while everybody was driving past, calling it a swamp." Hollis stood quiet for a long moment, doing the kind of math a man does when the joke he told 6 months earlier is standing right in front of him, wearing a different face. "You knew this was coming." "I didn't know," Wendell said. "I just knew the ground here could hold water if I gave it the chance, and that giving it the chance costs nothing when the water's already running past for free. Whether the drought came or not, I was never going to lose anything by trying." By September, Wendell's recharge field had become the most photographed 40 acres in Larkspur County, though not for its beauty. The county water district sent Dr. Priya Rao back out with 2 graduate students to core sample the site and document what had become one of the clearest working examples of on-farm managed recharge in the region. A case study Rao would go on to present at 3 different county water meetings that fall, always with the same set of numbers: 60 acre-feet in, 18 feet of local water table rise, 1 well still running while 11 others along the same road had gone dry. Hollis Tate walked his own land with Wendell twice that September, looking for anything similar on his own property. And though his soil ran heavier and slower to drain than the Ashcroft gravel bed, they found a smaller pocket along his eastern boundary that Rao confirmed could handle a modest recharge program the following wet winter. Hollis started digging test pits himself before the leaves had even finished dropping. No longer the man who'd stood at the fence, calling it a swamp. The County Board of Supervisors held an emergency water session in October, and Wendell Ashcroft, a man who had never once spoken at a public meeting in 40 years of farming, stood up when they asked if anyone had questions and told the room exactly what he'd told Hollis at the fence line months earlier. The water was already coming through the county every wet winter. Most of it just kept going, downstream and gone, because almost nobody had built anywhere for it to stop. 7 other landowners along Larkspur Creek signed up for recharge assessments before the meeting had even ended. Wendell still walks out to that monitoring well most mornings before coal is up, the same weighted tape in his hand, the same notebook in his jacket pocket, though it has a lot more numbers in it now than it did that January. He doesn't tell the story as proof that he was smarter than his neighbors. He tells it as a story about paying attention to what the ground has been trying to say for longer than anyone bothered to listen. The water had always come through this valley in the wet years. It took one man willing to be laughed at through a whole winter to figure out where it was supposed to go. If this story reminded you that the quiet work often happens long before anyone can see why it matters, subscribe and stay with us. We tell stories like this one every week. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? And has your own land ever tried to tell you something before you were ready to listen?